Hello, everyone. I am Behruz Tabrizi. I'm the director of Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. And welcome to our webinar on this important topic of President Biden and Iran. Before introducing our guests, I'd like to go over some logistics of the webinar. The entire program would be no longer than 90 minutes. And we will start by our guests' opening remarks, around 10 minutes each. And then we would lead a conversation among ourselves and the panelists for around 20 minutes. And after that, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. There is a Q&A button on your screen, and you can submit your questions through that button. And I would like to ask you to be respectful and to the point, and we'll try to cover as many questions as possible within our time limit. So let me start by introducing our panelists. First, Trita Parsi, who's an award-winning author and an expert on US-Iranian relations, Iranian foreign politics, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. He has authored 3 books on US foreign policy and politics of the Middle East. I have to say, I hope Trita wouldn't be upset about this, but my favorite book still remains his first book, Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Iran, Israel, and the United States. You'll find incredible things in that book, which all appear so counterintuitive, but all books are really fantastic reads. Trita is the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and the co-founder and former president of the National Iranian American Council. Our second guest is Ellie Geranmayeh, she's a deputy director of the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She focuses on European foreign policy, on the Middle East, in particular in relation to Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. She closely follows and advises the nuclear negotiations between Iran and world powers from 2013 to 2015. She has authored numerous policy reports on these topics. And she's published and quoted widely by the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, The Guardian, Foreign Affairs, and I can go on and on among others. Our third guest, Negar Mortazavi, is an Iranian-American journalist and political analyst covering Iran in English and Persian. She is a frequent commentator on Iran at MSNBC, BBC, PRI, New York Times, Al Jazeera, Huffington Post, and other international outlets around the world. She is currently a columnist for The Independent. If you inhabit the world of Twitter and interested in following Iranian politics and Iran-US relations, she'll be the link to follow. Ms. Mortazavi is also the host of the popular Iran podcast. So without further ado, let me invite our first speaker, Trita Parsi, to talk a little bit about how can Biden presidency and his administration guide us through this meandering road of going back to reviving this Iran nuclear deal. Thank you so much, Trita.
Thank you so much, Behruz. Thank you for organizing this, for having me. Thank you for the other participants. Always a great pleasure to be on a panel with them. And thank you for all who are watching through Zoom this program. As Behruz mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about what challenges and pathways lie ahead of the Biden administration. And then if time permits, either in my comments now or later on in the Q&A, I'll be more than happy to provide some ideas for potential solutions, particularly solutions that can change some of the domestic political challenges that a return to the JCPOA is presenting the Biden administration. I think the first thing that has to be said is that the intent of the administration, of the Biden administration, I think is clear and should not, I see no reason to question it. I think the administration is very sincere about returning to the JCPOA. It's very positive that already both sides are talking about the same mechanism for returning to the JCPOA, which is through a compliance for compliance mechanism in which both sides essentially walk back into the deal and live up to all of their obligations. That mechanism, however, does not in and of itself resolve all tactical hurdles that come across the way. And right now, there seem to be stuck on an issue of who takes the first step. The US side insists, at least publicly, that the Iranians need to go back into compliance first, and then the US would follow. The Iranians have taken the opposite view and argue that because the US is the party that breached the deal and ended its participation in it, it has to take the first step. The Iranians have also suggested that the Europeans can help choreograph this in such a manner that it would end up working. I'm personally not terribly worried about this. We've seen numerous cases in which in the previous negotiations, there were challenges about timing and who would go first, etc. And eventually they were all resolved quite constructively and creatively because the political will existed and because time existed. This time around, time does not exist in the same way. I do believe the political will does exist because it lies so squarely in the national interest of both sides to go back into the deal and make sure that the JCPOA is alive and well. What I'm worried about, though, is not necessarily this specific instance, but it's the deeper meaning of it that I'm worried about, which is that part of the reason why there's a resistance for the US to just take this first step is because of a belief that going back into the deal means giving up leverage, because it would mean that the United States would have to undo the sanctions that Trump reimposed. And the dedication to that leverage seems to at times become overwhelming to the extent that it becomes more important than the actual outcome of the negotiation. So we're in a situation, large part because of domestic political pressures, that there's a fixation on leverage rather than a fixation on a solution that advances US interests. We're confusing the means with the ends. Leverage obviously is important because you need leverage in order as a means towards the end, but it cannot be treated as the end itself. And we've seen that in the past as well, that at times that fixation became so strong. So instead of moving in the smartest and most constructive way, there was almost a fixation with the idea of constantly doing that leverage amassing and keeping a score on that rather than focusing on the end score, which is how good is the agreement and how will it actually advance US national interest and security. And again, this is very much driven because you have an opposition that claims inside the country, we're talking about the United States, that claims that it's doing these different things because it wants to get a better deal, but there's good reasons to believe that at least many of them are putting forward obstacles precisely because they don't want to see a deal at all. But this puts political pressure on the negotiators, and it creates another problem, which is that if you act, it's not just about you amassing leverage, you have to demonstrate that you have deprived the other side of leverage. And if you haven't done that, yet you reach a good deal, that deal will be viewed as unworthy precisely because you didn't demonstrate that you took away leverage from the other side. So failing to demonstrate that essentially signal or is interpreted as you not negotiating hard enough. And as a result, you probably could have gotten a better deal. Let me give you an example that happened last time I think is really essential. And I'm hoping we don't commit the same mistake again. There was a tremendous amount of fixation on sanctions. and the manner in which the sanctions were putting pressure on the Iranians. And the overwhelming approach became that we're going to just sanction and cripple the Iranian economy until the Iranians cry uncle and come begging for negotiations. The Iranian response to that was to do their own leverage amassing, which was to just expand the nuclear program as aggressively as possible. And it ended up becoming a race between how quickly Obama could cripple the Iranian economy and force the Iranians to capitulate, or how quickly the Iranians could amass more LEU and expand their program so that their nuclear program would become a fait accompli, and by that force the United States to capitulate. What ended up happening is that by January 2013, it became clear to Obama that he couldn't cripple the Iranian economy as fast as the Iranians could advance their program. The Iranian nuclear clock was ticking faster. And he reached a conclusion that either if he just stayed the course, the United States would be faced only with two options. Either it would have to accept the de facto Iran, nuclear Iran, or go to war, unless something changed. And the thing that could change was a redefinition of what actually the US's position would be, not on the end game, but on the pathway to it. And in secret negotiations in Oman, for the first time ever, Obama, through Bill Burns, who was the negotiator at the time in those secret negotiations, accepted the Iranian red line, which was enrichment on Iranian soil. Once that was done, suddenly everything else opened up. And it led to the pathway in which real negotiations took place. And the end result, of course, was the Iranians are going to keep enrichment, but it's going to be with the right restrictions and with the right transparency measures. Now, here's the dirty secret. Everyone knew, everyone who was close to this knew that nothing really would come unless the United States accepted enrichment in Iran. But the fixation of sanctions essentially meant that we're going to first sanction them to the point so that if we have to give that concession, it will come at the end of the negotiations. It ended up having to be given in the very beginning in order to even get negotiations. Had the and the sanctions were not the reason why we had a breakthrough. The breakthrough came because we showed flexibility, and American flexibility begot Iranian flexibility. Had we done that 10 years earlier, instead of fixating on the leverage and the tactical utility of sanctions, we actually could have gotten a better JCPOA. Because in 2005, the Iranians gave an offer of capping their program at 5,000 centrifuges. I'm sorry, 3,000 centrifuges. And that was the opening offer, incidentally. The US completely neglected that proposal under Bush because anything above zero was unacceptable. By the time you actually got the JCPOA in 2015, the Iranians capped the program at 5,000 centrifuges. And had already had 10 more years of expanding their knowledge about the nuclear fuel cycle, and by that also coming closer to a nuclear weapons capability. So we ended up with, after a decade of sanctions, with a result that was still 2,000 more centrifuges than the opening offer that the Iranians had given in 2005. And I'm worried that if we continue to fixate on whatever illusionary idea we have about the leverage that sanction provides, because whatever we use, we have to counter it, we have to compare it to, okay, while we are doing sanctions, what are the other side doing? And what kind of leverage does that bring about? And at the end of the day, does it mean that our leverage is actually stronger comparatively or not? And I think that last decade of the, before the JCPOA clearly showed that that type of a fixation on sanctions as some sort of a tool that opens up everything turned out not to be true. It's not to say that sanctions cannot be useful, but it has to be a means to an end rather than something that is treated as even more important than the final result itself. And that's the trap that I'm worried that we will be going into right now, so early running into this roadblock about who goes first, which to a very large extent is driven by the fact that you have an opposition, political opposition, that is doing everything they can to either say that what the US is doing is making the US weaker, is giving up leverage, or ultimately essentially is unwise. So what can then be done? And I know I'm probably running out of time, but just quickly, what can be done in order to make sure that the domestic opposition becomes less of a problem than what has been in the past? I would throw out one idea here. in the JCPOA negotiations, American primary sanctions were never put on the table. Those are the sanctions that the US imposes on its own companies. The sanctions that were lifted were secondary sanctions, sanctions that the US imposed on foreign companies in order to be able to prevent investment and trade to go to Iran, which meant that once the JCPOA occurred, Chinese and European companies could go into the Iranian market, but American companies were still kept out. One of the results of that was that the constituency within the United States that felt that there was a stake for them in the survival of the JCPOA ended up being rather limited. And a very critical constituency, the American business community, had no particular benefit in the JCPOA, and as a result had no benefit in getting involved in the political debate about the survival of the JCPOA. That is a major element that has been outside of this conversation. If the United States, for instance, wants to see greater restrictions on the program, wants to see missiles, etc., be included, I think that might potentially be possible if primary sanctions are put on the table, because it would also have another benefit when it comes from an American domestic political side, which is that it actually could break the partisan attitude towards the JCPOA, in which many Republicans, at most, are against the JCPOA because they're Republicans, and many Democrats end up being in favor of it because that's the Democratic position. As long as that is the case, that is a problem, because it will signal to the Iranians that if there's a change of government in the United States, the JCPOA may once again end up going out the window. But if you actually put primary sanctions on the table, there's a potential that many Republicans, precisely because of the economic benefit it would bring to their domestic constituencies and their districts, actually would be able to switch side. And it could change the dynamic that we're seeing right now, both domestically during the negotiations, but also afterwards when it comes to the durability of the JCPOA. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Trita. There is really a lot to digest at this early point. And as usual, these are such incredible fine points that often raise more questions than offering solutions at the same time. So let me move on, and then we can come back to a conversation about a number of interesting points that you raised, Trita. And I want to go to Ellie Geranmayeh to talk a little bit about how do we see the Europeans' position in this. And I think one of the fascinating kind of elements of this row between the US and Iran was that it was in the way that Europeans were caught in between, and the way they tried to navigate their way around without somehow antagonizing the American administration, and at the same time being committed to JCPOA responsibilities. But how do you see now the Europeans' role? What is the most important elements of their policies towards this topic?
Thank you very much, Behruz, and thank you for the kind invitation to join you today. It's great to see so many attendees for this event. Clearly, Iran is one of the hot topics for foreign policy across the pond. I'm joining you from London, where I am very closely watching the positioning of the E3 members to the nuclear deal, plus the European Union. So let me share with you three quick takeaways I have at the moment on where the European positioning is on this issue. The first is that, after 4 years of really an uphill struggle from the European side with the transatlantic alliance on a number of issues, I would say the first crack in that alliance under the Trump administration emerged actually on the position towards the nuclear deal. The Europeans are really kind of breathing a sigh of relief now to have the Biden administration that has vowed to renew transatlantic ties back in the White House. And I think that there is a moment of deliberation happening in Europe about how they want to advise the new administration on its policies towards Iran, and that there are some consultations still ongoing among the E3. Now, the E3 have maintained throughout the Trump administration that the JCPOA, the nuclear deal in 2015, is the best deal that was out there within the realistic contours of what was possible from a diplomatic approach towards Iran. And it's important to note that the E3 countries and the European Union started this process with Iran way back in the early 2000s and have seen the ups and downs of different Iranian and American administrations come and go, and this file be taken hostage by really mainly domestic political factors in both countries. And so their position was that after over a decade of diplomacy, the JCPOA, despite the fact that it wasn't from a European perspective the perfect deal, should be preserved, and that the European Union should put all of its political weight behind trying to ring fence it from multiple attempts we saw under the Trump administration to sabotage it. Now, the role they ended up playing in that mix was really a political one. There were huge shortfalls in the ability of the European Union and the United Kingdom to demonstrate economic independence from US secondary sanctions, which were the most vast and unprecedented in their scale, and also in terms of the way these sanctions were politicized by the United States to scaremonger European businesses and entities away from Iran. And really, those shortfalls in what is now termed in Europe as economic sovereignty or autonomy, strategic autonomy, which is now we're hearing a lot about, were really shed to light very clearly. Now, my second point is, what's happened since the November election results became clear. And, the E3 have been pivoting, as I mentioned, to a position of consultation. And, the one area which I would be critical of their positioning now is that they're not as clear as they could be and they should be in terms of what they want from the Biden administration. There is a sense that the Europeans don't want to corner the Americans on its policy options, and actually want to show great flexibility in working with the new administration on finding a way out of the current crisis point with Iran over the nuclear issue. But I do think that the Europeans could have made much more valuable contributions by coming with a very concrete and firm set of proposals for the new administration after having had a number of weeks now to consult with Tehran on what it will take for Iran to reverse its nuclear activities and how to actually sequence those steps with reciprocal sanctions relief and economic relief from the other members of the nuclear agreement, and of course the United States. Another factor that has complicated the picture is the relationship with regional partners, namely Israel, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, who have become much more vocal, I think, in recent months than they had been in the previous round of nuclear talks in the European space, in terms of pushing for what I think are quite unrealistic demands, at least some of them, about what a quote unquote new process of diplomacy with Iran should look like. So there are calls, for example, for the Europeans and the United States to put regional issues first before the rejoining or restabilization of the nuclear deal. There are also calls for regional actors to be part of these talks, which again is really an impractical feature to think about, both politically and actually, really practically, to ask possibly 8 to 10 more countries to join talks with Iran at this stage on a nuclear issue. But I think we have seen some unhelpful mixed messages from European countries about the position towards regional actors and the nuclear deal. And they could have been much more clear at the moment that actually we need to have a prioritization of the nuclear issue, because from a European security interest and from a US security interest, this remains the priority issue, but that there will be swift and perhaps even parallel sets of talks on the regional issue in different formulas with different regional players at the table and Iran. And this is something that the Europeans, to their credit, actually, even under the Trump administration, started to work on, was this regional approach towards both de-escalating hot conflicts in the region, but also in terms of maritime security in the Strait of Hormuz. So there is an interest and appetite for those regional security talks, and for Europeans, I would say, to facilitate those discussions. A final point I would say is the Europeans are not quite clear about what to do at the moment with Iran's nuclear activities since 2019. Now, they at the beginning saw it as a very careful and managed process of escalation from Iran, but I think increasingly now some of the activities Iran has taken in response to continued US sanctions, which let's remember, from Iran's perspective, there has been no change in the maximum pressure policy despite the new administration coming in so far. And Iran is responding by increasing its research and development into nuclear, in nuclear space. And also it has threatened later this month to restrict access to international inspectors. Now, this latter point of inspections is a real sensitive area for the European countries. And the unprecedented degree of international monitoring of Iran's nuclear program was really the main asset that was keeping the Europeans engaged in the nuclear deal. Now, my concern is that we are really hitting an inflection point if the United States is moving not as fast as it could on reaching a policy position regarding rejoining the nuclear deal and how it goes about doing that. And we have the Iranian side escalating its nuclear activities and potentially restricting partially some of the access to international monitors later this month, that the Europeans will find themselves actually in one of the most difficult positions they have throughout the last 4 years on how they respond to what they perceive as Iranian violations of the deal. And there are some in Europe that are attracted also by the idea of this leverage argument that Trita mentioned, and the fact that they do want further talks on the nuclear issue and broader issues with Iran once the JCPOA has been stabilized. And they are left scratching their heads about how they actually get to that stage if the United States does lift all of its sanctions. But I think that point can be countered by multiple different political and economic arguments. And I just plug in a opinion piece that I co-authored last month in the CNN opinion pages about why this leverage argument has really become exhausted and is giving marginal returns, and a continuation of that by the Biden administration or the E3 would be a pathway to escalation. Now, some quick remarks on going forward and what should be happening. Now, I think we need to accept that from a European and Iranian perspective, relations have soured over the last 4 years, and confidence has eroded on both sides about the ability to respect the JCPOA. Now, my position is that the European countries and the EU need to urgently push both Tehran and Washington to come back into full compliance with the nuclear deal through a phased series of steps that happen quickly, where Iran can take some verifiable steps on nuclear reversal, which are then simultaneously responded to by economic relief, whether that's through direct sanctions easing by the United States or other ways of providing economic relief to Iran. Now, I think if we fail to do that in the coming month, frankly, we are really going to reach a point of nuclear crisis, renewed nuclear crisis with Iran, if Iran does indeed take this step to reduce inspection and monitoring. And at that stage, my position is that the Europeans should find a way to manage that potential crisis point and preserve the space for the Biden administration and the Rouhani administration to find a diplomatic way out of that crisis point. Now, here, I think the role of the European Union is particularly important The European Union's High Representative, Josep Borrell, plays a critical role as the coordinator of the Joint Commission body that was set up by the nuclear deal. And, this was something that Foreign Minister Zarif hinted at earlier this week, was that the coordinator can have a role in bringing the JCPOA parties together, perhaps also with the United States, to discuss the technical roadmap ahead for coming back into full compliance. And there are ways to consider having the United States, for example, join a urgent ad hoc meeting of the Joint Commission in an observer status. And in my view, this creates a safe zone politically for the US and Iran to have those really necessary bilateral talks on what they're each willing to give and what steps they're each willing to take reciprocally to get this process going. So I'll end there, Behruz, and hope we have a good conversation ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellie. This was so comprehensive. And again, like Trita's comments, there is so much to think about. And these are all important points that, on the surface, one thinks that, okay, why don't they do that? And then you realize all the kind of obstacles on the ground that how different players need to engage. But we'll get to that during question and answer. And I would like to now ask Negar Mortazavi to talk a bit more about what's going on inside Iran. And as Trita mentioned, this is as much as a domestic problem as a foreign relation problem. And both Iran and the US always are sort of out of sync in their presidential elections and the way these sort of political situations go hand in hand in two countries. So Negar, would you just let us know what's the Iranian side's analysis of this and what kind of possibilities do they see in a new Biden administration in terms of going back to the original nuclear agreement?
Sure. Thank you, Behruz, and thank you to the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for inviting us and for holding this important event. And I see 153 participants. Thanks to all of you for tuning in and for listening. And thanks to my co-panelists, Trita and Ellie. It's great to see you both. So just to pick up on the points mentioned by Ellie and also by Trita, I want to take a look more on the domestic politics inside Iran, as you said, Behruz, and give you more of a perspective also of how the Iranian side sees these things, and then talk about this window of opportunity, which I think a golden window of opportunity that is open right now, but is closing in a very short time, as many of the window of opportunities between Tehran and Washington in the past few decades. So first of all, I want to mention 3 important dates coming up. I'll start from the furthest one. In August, the administration of Hassan Rouhani will basically end its work and a new president will be starting work in Iran. We don't know who yet. And that is going to be determined in June. This is the second date, which is the Iranian presidential election coming up. It's actually a very important, significant presidential election. It's the end of the second term of Hassan Rouhani, so he can't be president anymore. And we still don't know how the domestic dynamics and the politics of Iranian elections are going to work out. Usually presidential elections are very important in Iran, but they play out in the final few weeks. We won't probably know until less than a month to the election how which candidate has the upper hand and how they're doing in the polls. And then the third date that's coming up closest to us is February 21st, which is when the Iranian parliament has mandated basically an expansion of the nuclear program and a reduction in the inspections of the International Atomic Energy Watchdog, and basically a ramping up of what Tehran sees as leverage when it comes to diplomacy with the United States. And I think this is very important because when we hear this talk of leverage that Trita was mentioning here in Washington and now to some extent in European capitals, there is also this idea or perception of leverage in Tehran. The Iranians are also trying, at least the hardliners, to push the moderates in ways that they can leverage in case the United States is going to use whatever the maximum pressure era sanction can be, and this package of leverage basically that we also see from the more hawkish corners here in Washington being pushed on the Biden administration. So these are three important dates, and I think all of them are pushing us into realizing that there should be an urgency, and this window of opportunity should be taken very seriously by the Biden administration. And again, the domestic side of this issue is playing out in both capitals, as Trita mentioned. In Tehran, the Rouhani administration is outgoing. It's very weak because the main premise of this administration was the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, re-engaging with the world, with the West, and as a result of that, a better economy, which is essentially what every citizen in the world cares about when it comes to elections. And that hasn't been very successful. In the Trump era, when the US pulled out of the nuclear deal, the Iranian economy has been in shambles, and it's just weakened that pro-diplomacy camp in Iran very, very much, and in a way strengthened the hands of the hardliners, meanwhile also putting a lot of pressure on the Iranian civil society. We've seen the human rights situation is also very severe. Any form of dissent is protests or crackdown repressed very severely, and hardliners have gained some form of strength in a combination of this lack of a diplomatic avenue and also outside pressure and forces, military tension, assassinations of the Iranian top general, the Iranian top scientist. All of these play out in closing the political space inside Iran more, putting this pressure on the civil society and on the more moderate and reformist camps, and basically in a way strengthening the hardline politics of the country inside the borders. But there's still hope. It's not, I'm not all pessimistic. And we heard from the State Department actually last night, the State Department spokesperson, Ned Price, about the urgency of this return to the nuclear deal. And basically, as the Biden team is putting it, to stop Iran from getting close to ever being able to produce a nuclear weapon. We know that Iran is acquiring more of the material, the fissile material that can potentially be used. Not that Iran has a nuclear weapons program right now. And then we also see this urgency, at least from the pro-diplomacy or the moderate camp inside Iran, that obviously the Rouhani team wants to save its foreign policy legacy, which is the JCPOA. And they have been telling their domestic audiences that it is the Trump administration who unraveled this deal or put it on life support, as we say. It's not dead yet, but the deal is on life support, and that this few months of the Biden administration can still be potentially a way to revive diplomacy. And if this does happen, if this diplomacy, this engagement starts, which indications are that it has already, at least track 2, and if a return back to the JCPOA happens fast, and if Iranians on the ground basically see an economic return or any form of prospect, even, it doesn't have to be immediate, but any form of a prospect for a more opening, for a better economic future, because right now it's all dark and hopeless. If that opening and prospect is seen, then that could potentially help the moderate/reformist camp when it comes to the presidential election to possibly regroup, to strengthen the hand, and also to increase participation from their political base, because right now that political base is very hopeless, and there's a low chance of them participating in the election. And possibly the next administration for the next 8 years also being someone of a more moderate and pro-diplomacy view, which would then make it easier for the Biden administration to continue their diplomacy, the follow-on negotiations, and these other issues that they've been talking about. And it would obviously be very different for Iran's domestic politics. But if this doesn't happen, if the return to the JCPOA doesn't happen fast, because we also hear from some more hawkish corners again in Washington that they're saying, okay, maybe diplomacy is not so bad, but take it easy. Don't go so fast. Don't rush it. Take your time. if this doesn't happen, or if it doesn't happen very fast, it could have a negative impact on the camp of the moderate/reformers in the election. It can strengthen the hardliners, which is essentially the hardline candidates, or part of the mainstream hardline candidates for the election actually don't want this return to JCPOA to happen immediately and in the Rouhani era, and they want to delay it. So I can basically, just to conclude, put it that hardliners on both sides seem to not want to rush this or at all let it happen, while the pro-diplomacy camp, which is the Rouhani administration, and now here we have the pro-diplomacy camp in the White House, want to make it happen. There's a small window of opportunity. I think both sides need to move very fast. The Europeans have a very important role to play here, as they did with the actual the initial negotiations. They can help it make it happen, choreograph, as it said, both sides, and create a sequence and a way, basically a process for a mutual return to the terms of the nuclear deal. But if it doesn't happen very fast, I think the dynamics of the election are going to be very different. And just to very quickly mention some of the top candidates, we have Ishaq Jahangiri, a vice president to Rouhani, who may be a top contender for the reformists. He's not very popular, but it's one of the people that they've been talking about. Saeed Mohammad of the Revolutionary Guards camp is also a top contender. There's a possibility that Ibrahim Raisi, the current head of the Iranian judiciary, also a hardliner, might be running again. He ran against Hassan Rouhani in the election and lost, but he might be running again. And there's also Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who you'll probably all know. He wants to have a comeback. It's still not clear if he would be allowed to run. And it seems like his own party is not very interested in taking him in as a candidate, but he might be running on his own platform. And if he's approved as a candidate, that would make it a very interesting race. And then eventually there's also Javad Zarif, who says he doesn't want to run. I don't believe he wants to run, but again, going back to those final 3 weeks, which are very instrumental in determining the direction of the politics. We'll see what happens. And then obviously Larijani, who is more of a conservative / moderate, closer to the Hassan Rouhani camp, but he could possibly also be a candidate that eventually the moderates and the reformists might agree on as their final candidate against a top hardliner. Okay, I'll stop there, but I'm happy to answer any questions also.
Thank you so much, Negar. As you were speaking, we could hear the sirens also coming in,
Sorry about that.
I didn't know whether it's coming from your side or my side.
No, it's my side. I'm in Washington, downtown.
You talk about sensitive issues. You hear the sirens. And thank you all three. This was so wonderful, and I want to. Many questions are raised, and many questions actually were raised before even you start speaking, and it reminds me of one of my student evaluations some years ago, which was the most curious student evaluation I ever got, that said that this was the worst class I have ever taken in my education, and Professor Gamari was very unorganized. His lectures didn't make any sense, and it was the worst class, and this and that, and that's why I stopped going to class after the very first meeting. And I thought that that's a sort of interesting paradox, that if somebody stopped going to class after the first meeting, how could he or she have this kind of judgment about what the class was all about? And I always thought that, when you raise a question before even hearing the speaker, that's sort of an interesting curiosity. But there are a series of questions. I want to sort of try to bring all these questions together, including my own. And I want to go back to this question of national interest, and to see how each of these actors here, the EU and the UK and the US and Iran, how are they defining their national interest? Because it's a kind of an interesting topic that who determines at the end what the national interest is, and it's interesting also how this kind of JCPOA have been folded into this conversation about national interest, because once you enter that world, there are so many competing arguments, and how can we sort of sort through these competing arguments and to find a version of, for the lack of a better word, hegemonic definition of national interest that would guide different parties to determine what is the right policy for them in relation to their national interest. I pose this to all three. I mean, you can start, or if you don't want to answer that question, we can move on to other questions. Trita, should we start with you?
I'll be happy to take a step. I really like the question because it presumes that there's a lot of conversation in Washington about national interest. I wish there was. I really wish there was. I'm not frankly seeing it. I think so much of what is happening is on autopilot. Moreover, if you take a close look at the arguments, for instance, against the JCPOA, so much of it is explicitly devoid of any reference or link to US national interests. Instead, it's a focus on 3 countries in the Middle East don't like it, or they feel abandoned by it. And the implicit argument that it is in the national interest of the United States to set aside its own interest and just be a good ally and follow what the interests of the allies are. And I think we see that very clearly right now when it comes to the idea of going back into the JCPOA, the volume and the decibel of the objections of a very, very small number of countries that nevertheless are obviously very powerful and have very strong voices in Washington. But looking at what their arguments are, it has far less to do with whether this is good for the United States or not, even whether it's good for the region, and very much about their own interest. And I say, you know, in my view, I do not believe we should expect anything different from them. In fact, more power to them for having a very clear idea what their national interest is and pursuing it. Now, I think sometimes they pursue it in too aggressive of a way, mindful of the fact that they should be cognizant of the negative impacts it can have on their relationship with the United States when they, for instance, deliberately and quite aggressively obstruct what the US is trying to do. But nevertheless, they have a definition of it and they go forward. I wish the US had the same. I wish the US actually had a much clearer understanding of what its national interest was and made sure that be the centerpiece of how it pursues and formulates its policies on the JCPOA, but also on the region writ large.
Not too much to add to what Trita was saying, but I think it's important that to understand that the negotiations were multilateral. There were different parties, and I see this being mentioned in the questions also. And I think it's just diplomacy, and a lack of military tension is beneficial to all sides. Nobody has benefited from this increased military environment in the region, be it the United States, whose population is far away from the region, but it's US forces who are there, be it other populations in the Middle East beyond just Iran and the US allies and US foes, and then also the other parties to the nuclear negotiations who've tried so hard under the Trump years to keep it alive beyond just the Europeans, but the Russian and Chinese also. And I think a return back to diplomacy would make sense, and we've seen it for all sides. But again, the domestic politics and the domestic posturing gets in the way of a lot of what you think makes sense as a matter of both foreign policy and national security.
No, I was just saying that I think from a European perspective, they did a pretty solid job of protecting their national security interests vis-a-vis the nuclear agreement under the Trump administration. While I think the hope and the ambition was to be able to do more, I do think that we sometimes underestimate the degree of courage it took on behalf of, particularly, I would say, the United Kingdom, to stick to a common European position of denying the United States, for example, the right, as it asserted at the UN Security Council, to snap back sanctions in September against Iran. And they did maintain a very unified, consistent position that the nuclear deal was the best one out there that met their national security interests in terms of containing the perceived risks from Iran's nuclear program. Now, my hope is that they can continue doing the same in terms of seeing the urgency and the need of getting this deal back on track. But we'll have to see how history plays out on that one.
Very good. Indeed, I mean, that's a very complicated question. And indeed, one of our audiences raised that question, is there such thing as national interest? You know, that it's a very complicated, of course, question that it's always something, a work in progress somehow. And there are also many different kinds of discussions now about the way Biden administration is forming. And we see the reflection of those competing interests in the way the appointments are moving forward. And on the one hand, we see like the appointment of Rob Malley and then Blinken, and the way the two see the fate of Iran, the US relations, and how it's going to work out. Do we see that problem also in general, that in order to heed to these different kinds of interests, particularly now in the US with the new administration, there is a kind of a conflicting interest that might prevent the Biden administration from moving forward in making a very clear policy about whether or not they want to revive JCPOA?
Again, as I said in my opening statement, I don't doubt that the administration actually has decided that they want to revive the JCPOA and that they want to go beyond it, that after the JCPOA is respected by all sides, they want to quickly start add-on negotiations and address both things in the JCPOA and beyond. We do read in the news, it's public now, that there's a desire to make sure that there's no groupthink taking place within the government, so that alternative perspectives are included in the team. And I think, clearly there's some value in that. Groupthink is obviously not particularly good, but it's not as if the opposition to the JCPOA or opposition and manners of negotiating are not heard. I mean, they're quite prominent in the media. One instructive example may actually be to take a look at what happened between Obama administration 1, Obama administration 2. There was far greater ideological cohesiveness within Obama 2. I remember in my conversations with Obama team, sometimes when I was frustrated and I thought that the Obama administration was not moving fast enough and in a sufficiently convincing way with diplomacy, many people in the NSC, told me that you should remember, no one wants diplomacy in the administration more than Obama himself. And my counter to them were, well, why doesn't he hire more people that thinks like him in that case in order to make it happen? Because reality is that when you're trying to make that big of a shift of 40 years of containment, institutionalized enmity, and you want to change it, it requires ideological cohesion within the team of the president to be able to make that, instead of constantly having folks that, however legitimate their views are, may not really share that objective, and as a result become obstacles or at a minimum not helpful. And I think if I understand what the Obama administration, what the Biden administration is seeking to do, which is not just the JCPOA, but then move towards a regional dialogue. And with that regional dialogue will also come a different American military posture in the region. We're talking about some significant changes here. It does require that alternative voices are included, but there are mechanisms for that. There are plenty of mechanisms for that. But I think if you're trying to do something big like this, you need to have a cohesive team and with a very shared sense of what the purpose and the goal is, in order to make sure that you have the political will and all of the other things that are needed to be able to make that big of a shift.
Can I make a quick note?
Sure, Negar.
I agree with Trita, and I think the Biden team is facing resistance both from the Republicans and also from within his own party. Let's not forget, there were senior Democrats under Obama who were opposed to the nuclear deal. There were few, but there were some of them very vocal. And over the years also, there's been disagreements. And right now, the Biden administration is dealing with a situation that the attempt is to unite a very divided country, and it is a very divided and very polarized country. This city, Washington, is become very polarized. So the attempt is to unite this country domestically, but then they're also dealing with this very urgent foreign policy issue that has been very divisive, even to some extent in his own party. So there needs to be a strong will and a lot of political capital basically spent to make this happen and make it happen fast. But the only positive point for the Biden administration and the difference with Obama is that the deal already exists. So Obama had to go make a deal, but the Biden team just needs to return to it. So that makes it a little easier and faster for them.
Yeah, I think that's a good sort of transition to the question that the number of people raised here, and I'm going to sort of try to put all of them together in the question of leverage. And so obviously when we are thinking about diplomacy and negotiation, different sides of those negotiations are thinking about leverage. What is the Iranians' leverage today? What is the Americans' leverage? What is the EU leverage? And how are they going to bring into these new conversations their own leverage to get extra points? Some people, for example, also in questions that I've received, raised the question, for example, that this is an important point for the US and European allies to raise questions of human rights violations, for example, in Iran, to say that that also should be part of this conversation about return to the JCPOA. And it was flawed from the beginning because it didn't include the questions of human rights and civil liberties in Iran and so on and so forth. So how do we envision that each side is thinking about their own leverage? I mean, one of the questions that I received was that why should, for example, Iranians don't think that they should go full force, full speed in enrichment of uranium, because that inevitably put them in a better position to use that as a leverage to get back to the original agreement. So there are so many different parts, moving parts in this question of leverage that I would like each of you to comment on.
I think, again, framing the conversation in terms of leverage as that question about why shouldn't the Iranians just go full speed with enrichment is the wrong lens for this. We have a situation in which the two sides actually have a clear interest in going back into the deal, both for the Iranians because they need the sanctions relief and they need the political rehabilitation that the JCPOA brought about. It was an end to 40 years of containment policy by the US. The US side needs it, partly because it closes off the path for Iran to get a nuclear weapon, but also because any idea of being able to reduce the US's military role in the region necessitates resolving this issue, because this is the issue that has the highest risk of bringing the US back into a hot war in the region. So instead of looking at it from the perspective of leverage, I think we need to start off by looking at it from the perspective, where are the shared interests that exist that can be further explored? I mean, part of the reason that the Iranians stayed in the deal, despite the fact that the Trump administration walked out of the deal, breached the deal, and put Iran in the very awkward situation of being more sanctioned when it was in the JCPOA than it was before the JCPOA even existed. Well, to me, it was at times surprising that they stayed in, but I think the answer to it is because it lied so squarely in their interest to sustain the JCPOA precisely because it offered that pathway for political rehabilitation, and that was more important. And that's a good thing, because if we have a deal that only will be respected as long as you have a stick over the head of the other side, and it essentially means that they don't want to be in that deal, but you're forcing them to be in that deal will never last. A deal that lasts is one that actually is mutually beneficial and ensure that both sides actually feel that, yes, we have a need for this to survive. So there's no need. I'm not saying that there can't be other elements added to it, but there's no fundamental need to have a stick on the other head or above the other head in order to make sure that they stay within the deal. And that's part of the reason I think it's important to start transitioning out of this lens of, at this stage in the negotiations, look at it solely from the leverage perspective. There are going to be phases in a negotiation in which you do get into a zero-sum situation, and it should be towards the end when they're figuring out final details. In this phase, it should be an expanded pie approach towards that is much more focused on the shared interests and how they can work within that framework rather than focusing on leverage. Because if you do that too early, you're most likely going to ruin any chance of getting a deal at all.
And I guess what you say also, in a sense, an answer to the question of why shouldn't question of human rights violations and civil liberties be included beforehand in negotiations.
Well, no, that's a different story, though. You have to keep in mind there was a legal basis for being able to raise this issue of Iran's nuclear program and take it all the way to the UN Security Council. And the legal basis for it was that Iran was a signatory to the NPT. And because of judgment that he had violated that, the IAEA board sent the matter to the Security Council under Chapter 7 because this was deemed a potential threat to international security and stability. It meant that the negotiations would take place within the P5, which then was, of course, expanded to P5+1, or actually it started off with the E3, but nevertheless. And there was a necessity of focusing on what the P5+1 agreed upon vis-a-vis Iran. There is no agreement on human rights. The Chinese, the Russians have a completely different perspective. It's also one of the reasons why it wasn't practical to, in the P5+1 setting, bring in Syria and other issues, because again, there was no consensus. This was feared by the US side that would be exploited by the Iranians to create so much divisions within the P5+1 that it would make the negotiations too difficult. So they needed to zero in on that. In addition to that, it's important to keep in mind, the countries that were most adamant about making sure that Syria and other regional issues were not included were Saudi Arabia and Israel, who both separately lobbied Washington to not expand the negotiations. From the Israeli side was because they thought the likelihood of getting a deal on the nuclear issue was so small that that is what they wanted. They wanted to focus on something that would not lead to a deal. If you expanded it to regional issues, they feared that Iran would be able to use concessions in Syria in order to get more for what they wanted on the nuclear issue. Yeah. The Saudis had a different perspective. Their perspective was essentially...
Sorry, let me stop you here because I do have a number of questions that
specifically my apologies.
Talk about the regional players, and I want to get back to you later in response to those regional players and how do we sort of gauge their role in all this. But I apologize for stopping you here because I wanted to ask that question separately. But I want to go back to the question of leverage to Negar and Ellie and see how do they see like what Iran or Europeans or the US should view this question of leverage, and how do they re-engage in talks based on what they can use as leverage.
I'll offer some quick thoughts from the European side. So look, I think right now the main concern for them is if the United States rolls back all of the Trump era sanctions, what is the linkage that then takes the stage of negotiation one step further, whether that's on the nuclear issues or beyond? And their point is that actually now when we have a more genuine prospect that the US is going to be committed to the diplomatic effort than we did under the Trump administration, hey, there might be a moment to use these sanctions as a stick to get more concessions and squeeze more out of Iran. Now, my viewpoint on this is that this doesn't add up either politically or economically. If Iran was willing to absorb the cost of maximum pressure era sanctions under the Trump administration and it was unwilling to really give in and capitulate to the maximalist demands that were being made by President Trump's team, then I don't see why it would enter into the same terms and the same context of negotiations with the Biden administration, particularly at a time that on an economic level, despite the fact that on a people level, ordinary people are undergoing extensive hardship as a result of not just sanctions, but also mismanagement of the economy and the effect of the COVID pandemic. We are seeing the leadership now getting in quite a confident position about the economic outlook, not just because it has managed to limp along these unprecedented sanctions, but because you now have the IMF and the World Bank and others predicting that Iran is actually going to enter a period of small but still notable positive economic growth in the coming 2 years. And that's even under a prediction that maximum pressure sanctions would continue. So there is, I think, a political case and an economic case being made in Iran that maybe we can, quote unquote, immunize the country from US sanctions and once and for all stop this stick and leverage tool the Americans see being used against Iran time and time again. So in my view, if this opportunity, when Iran is really leaving the door open for coming back into compliance with the JCPOA, is missed because of a misguided perception that either the Europeans or the Americans or together they have some sort of a leverage to push Iran into more concessions, I think we will really miss this window, and actually we will see it as a pathway to further confrontation and escalation like the way we've seen. And a quick point on the human rights issue, which is an area that, despite sticking to the deal, Europeans have consistently brought up as an area for discussions with Iranians on a number of different consultations and meetings that they've had over recent years. And I think from the European perspective, having a diplomatic channel with Iran through which they can raise these concerns is a tool to be used relative to what we had under the Trump era, which was zero communication channels on the human rights front. And my own view is that trying to tackle the human rights issues, the nuclear issues, the regional issues, bundling them all up together is a recipe for getting nowhere on all of the issues. So as Trita mentioned, the reason why progress was made on the nuclear issue was because you had a very unprecedented alignment between world powers on how to tackle Iran. Now, if you start adding potentially 7 or 10 more cooks into the mix, I foresee it taking decades to get to a common position on any of these issues, including the human rights issues. Thanks, members.
Thank you. So, Negar, why shouldn't Iran just go full speed and enriching uranium to gain leverage?
Well, there are some factions in Iran who actually think like that, because I say leverage is the new name for force or for pressure. On this side, we had the Trump/Pompeo camp who thought they should go full on, piling sanctions after sanctions or pressure after pressure, military pressure, assassinations, circling Iran with US forces to make them capitulate. And we saw that didn't happen. Basically, maximum pressure turned into the opposite of itself and became maximum failure. And the same dynamic is happening in Iran also. We don't see that calculation of going full on leverage or pressure as playing out with all of the different political factions for the same reasons, because it backfires and essentially turns into the opposite of itself. I also want to add a comment to the human rights issue, and that is, besides just not being able to mix all of these issues together, that the Europeans are also better positioned to lead or to spearhead these discussions on the issue of human rights with Iran than the US is, especially after 4 years of the Trump administration, the double standard that a lot of Iranians or even rights activists point to when it comes to US allies in the region, like Saudi Arabia and other rights abusers, and it comes to Iran and how the Trump administration specifically politicized human rights, and also this myth or perception that somehow the Trump administration helped human rights in Iran. It didn't. I mean, tweets in Farsi or hashtags, yes, they got a lot of traction on social media, but the actual human rights situation underground actually got much worse in the years of maximum pressure. Any form of dissent has been completely repressed. Protests have been cracked down. So there hasn't been actual help to the people on the ground and the rights activists and the civil society.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you know, again, there are a number of questions about regional actors, and I think it's fair to say that President Macron's announcement a couple of days ago that Saudi Arabia needs to be part of the agreement came as a surprise to many people, and I wonder, what's the logic? What's the logic behind? Again, Trita started to talk about this important issue, but what's the logic behind including more regional actors, namely here Israel or Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, as parties to the revamped and renegotiated JCPOA? So, what are the sort of some positive elements, if there are any, or negative ones here? And Ellie, why?
You want me to go?
Let me just also highlight this. I wonder if Ellie wants to comment. You can go after Trita on what was behind Macron's sudden announcement, and it really truly came as a shock. But Trita, you can go, and then Ellie can address that question.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'll let Ellie handle the French dimension here. Look, I don't think there is any logic in including them in the nuclear talks, to be frank with you. I mean, from their perspective, they have shown quite clearly that they don't want to see any deal at all. It's not about what the details of the deal are. It's about the fact that the US, together with the P5+1, is striking a deal with Iran. The Israelis even articulated that very clearly publicly for the first time just about a week or so ago, when a senior military official said, even if you improve the deal, there shouldn't be any deal. So I don't see any logic in including them in that. I mean, they've shown their hands quite clearly that from their perspective, they prefer there not to be a deal. They prefer there to be a permanent state of enmity between the United States and Iran, which in many ways, particularly from the perspective of the Saudis and the UAE, would add a layer of protection for them vis-a-vis Iran from the United States. However, when it comes to the add-on agreements that address the regional issues, particularly if those add-on agreements are designed in such a way that their potential failure would not jeopardize the JCPOA. So it's not an opportunity for someone to get into the add-on agreements to sabotage not just those, but also the JCPOA. So if there's a significant wall between them, then I think it is absolutely crucial to include Saudi Arabia and the UAE if we're focusing, for instance, on Persian Gulf security. There's no value having that conversation just between the P5+1 and the US and Iran if the Saudis and the UAE and others in the Persian Gulf are not included. But I think we also have to recognize what that means. It does not mean that those countries alone can then just add all kinds of issues onto the agenda, and that's the end of it. I hope they do. I hope whatever concerns they have, they put it on the agenda. But it also means that their conduct will be on the agenda. Their role in not just Yemen, but in elsewhere in the region, funding of terrorism, their massive arms purchases are also then on the agenda. And ultimately, I think that's really great, because all of those issues, everything Iran is doing that this side finds very, very problematic, but also the things they're doing that the Iranians find problematic. There needs to be a forum in which this is being discussed and resolved through dialogue rather than what has been done so far. But it requires a readiness for all of them of this, and not coming into this believing that this is just an opportunity to put forward demands, but not accept that there has to be concessions from their side as well. I mean, again, that was part of the beauty of the JCPOA. It was really a deal in which all sides had to give concessions in order to get concessions. And that is going to be needed between the Iranians and the Saudis and the UAE as well.
I'll have a stab at trying to unpack
now you're
the mindset of President Macron.
Unlike the mystery here for us.
Look, I think that the French president could have been much more clearer in his messaging about exactly what he intended by that statement, particularly given that we are in a very sensitive period for the position in Tehran and the United States. Now, my own interpretation is that the comments are influenced by several things. One is that President Macron is due to have a high-level state visit to Saudi Arabia and potentially the United Arab Emirates in the coming weeks ahead. And so this may have been some preparation on a high-level political level to signal to very important economic and security partners for France in the region that they will be consulted. Now, I think what may have been lost in translation or interpretation is the difference between consulting regional allies versus actually opening a door for them to have a seat at the table, which is frankly not a decision for France to make, nor any one party to the nuclear deal. As Trita mentioned, there is a legal basis on which the JCPOA party formulation was created, and it's not up to one member to add or remove or kick out other members. So my sense is that this was a moment of opportunity for France, when we're going back to national interests, to advocate for its own national interests ahead of this meeting. But what I hope it's not an indication of is a repeat of what we saw in the previous nuclear talks in 2014, 2015, where there were some unfortunate moments of public differences being displayed between France and, frankly, even some other Europeans and even the US positioning on the nuclear issue, which really didn't help create a solid positioning from the West towards Iran when it came to the nuclear talks. So I think it will be really important, as the Biden administration has said, to have a short period of very intensive consultations where everybody gets their positions unified on the US re-entry to the JCPOA and who exactly is going to be leading those talks. Thanks, Behrouz.
Thank you. So Negar, do you want to jump in on that issue of regional players?
Sure. I also think that adding any issues to the current deal or any seats to the table doesn't make any sense. It's already an agreement that took years of intense negotiations to be made on both sides. Both sides, or the multiple sides, made concessions, had demands, and eventually agreed on something that's also very comprehensive. So assuming that anyone can throw anything into the pot at this point doesn't make sense. But then at the same time, the French comments could be read, I think it was a little bit ambiguous as far as new negotiations. Does that mean negotiations after a return to the JCPOA? Some interpreted as such. And on the regional issue, and again, as also Trita mentioned, Iran has a lot of grievances when it comes to regional issues, US presence in the region, US allies. And the other side also has demands. And I think it's important that these talks continue. And I just want to mention the issue, one side issue, but it circles back to both human rights and US-Iran talks. It's this issue of dual national prisoners. There's dual national Iranian Americans in Iran who've been jailed, and some Europeans, some other dual national prisoners. This is also an issue that's very important both here in Washington for the administration, groups outside the administration, and also Iranians in the diaspora and some European capitals. If negotiations can simultaneously happen, as they did under the Obama years, for the release of those prisoners or some form of prisoner exchange, I think that's something that should be seen as part of this bigger issue of human rights. And then also the issue of how sanctions have impacted Iranians under a pandemic, because the US sanctions are essentially limiting Iranians' right to health. And I think that goes also in the big picture of human rights when we talk about human rights of all of these moving parts.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Negar, because there are a couple of questions about whether or not this condition of pandemic could generate an opportunity to make a humanitarian argument for going back to diplomacy and making it easier to sort of revive the nuclear agreement and lift the sanctions. So that's an important issue. I also want to mention that there a couple of questions we had about the role of China and Russia, and because this, after all, it was 5+1, and it wasn't only the US, European allies, I want to say that in a couple of weeks we have another webinar, and I'm doing a little bit of advertising here, called the Eastbound Iran, and we specifically want to address the question of Russia, China, and India, and how they can sort of provide a new frame for Iran's engagement with the world. So stay tuned for in 2 weeks. We have that conversation in more detail. I want to one question that I thought it is quite interesting is that the question of this kind of change in world politics in terms of framing diplomacy, the framing of all these questions, specifically about sort of the rise of Trump and Trumpism and this kind of anti-liberal democratic politics that has transformed not only the American politics, but at the world stage, there's a transformation that is happening here in the world, in Brazil, in India. So do you think that this new kind of opening or framing of liberal democratic politics has any kind of bearing on the way we can rethink and renegotiate these types of agreements and such as JCPOA? This kind of sort of more right-wing populist kind of thing that obviously, I mean, Negar can talk about this possibility of rising that kind of populism in Iran as well. And how would this kind of new paradigm of global politics plays out in rethinking the agreements such as JCPOA? It's a little bit of a hard question.
I think Ellie is perfectly situated for this one.
Okay, Trita, thanks for that. I will respond with some thoughts. I'm not sure it's quite the answer you were looking for, but look, in my view, we have had at least for the last 20 years, several different experiments, particularly on the US-Iran side, of having different formulations of governments with very different worldviews. And we've seen how the diplomatic track plays out, despite the fact that the supreme leader in Iran has remained the same figure. We have seen that the executive branch, despite the extensive limits on its powers in Iran, has been able to achieve different things when it comes to diplomacy with the United States. So we saw a very different positioning under former President Khatami than we saw under President Ahmadinejad, and his more conservative right-wing ideological views that really tarnished and damaged relations with not just the United States, but also the European Union across the board. And that was really the period of time where the world powers coalesced and unified on a common position towards Iran's nuclear program. And I remember when Trump first came in, there were a lot of people in Iran debating whether actually President Trump, as the outsider populist who was coming in, could actually provide Iran with a lot of added rewards and would be further away from the ideological thinking that they perceive the Democrats as having towards Iran. Well, we now, from the Iranian perspective, have 4 years of testing out a populist American president who was basically unwilling or unable to make any progress on the diplomatic approach with Iran. So I do think that there are many that would say that it really doesn't matter who comes to power in the executive branch in Iran in the next elections. But in my view, these personalities do have an impact not just on the way diplomacy is conducted and confidence building is made, but also, frankly, in the technocratic teams that are in place and are able to deliver on diplomacy. In the Trump administration, I think that technocratic capability was really not there for diplomatic progress, whereas in the Iranian system, we have that now in place, which is why I do think that the timeline of Iran's elections are a factor that the US administration should bear in mind.
I'll add a note about the internal dynamics of Iran, because this is something that the underlying rise of populism and this sort of, as I call it, the disenfranchised classes, the working classes against the elite, the swamp, as they call it here in Washington. And it's something that we see some of those dynamics playing out in Iran in the past 2 decades. Also, the rise of someone like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in the early 2000s was precisely a response to that corrupt elite class in that famous first election, presidential election that Ahmadinejad won against Hashemi Rafsanjani. He was the embodiment of what at least part of the population saw as corruption in the political elite. When, of course, we saw how Ahmadinejad and that populism also turned out. But this line of corruption is actually one of the main topics that are going to be front and center in the upcoming presidential election in Iran. So there's going to be foreign policy, but there's also going to be corruption. There's rampant corruption, and it's among both the reformists, moderates, and the hardliners. And it's something that new generations in all the different factions are trying to tackle and go against. And some of those I see as parallels, but then also it's the populism and this anti-liberal wave that's going both in the US and also Europe.
Yeah. Wonderful. We are reaching the end of our panel, and this was so rich and substantive and quite illuminating. And I would like to thank the three of you for first accepting our invitation and offering such thoughtful comments on this very, very important issue. Hopefully we can have follow-ups on this and next time, perhaps in person,